are going to meet with you today and talk about maximizing your students' potential, talk with you about meaningful participation in the IEP process. We have a great team from our special education department here today, so I will go through and introduce them by name, and they will wave at the camera for now, and you will be hearing from them throughout about the next hour. As I said, I'm Carrie Cooper, Special Education Director. We have Kathleen McCarthy. She is our mental health therapist. We have Lindsay Rasmussen. She's a teacher on special assignment. We have Julia Siegel. She's our orthopedic impairment specialist. Hillary Talmadge, our program specialist. And so throughout, and we have Mr. Soto, our parent engagement educator, with us hosting. So these are the questions we are aiming to answer today, and at the end, we will have time to hear additional questions from you. So we want to talk about, in general, what is special education? How does a student become eligible for special education? What is an IEP? What might I expect before the IEP meeting? What are my rights as a parent? What can I expect at my child's IEP meeting? How can I participate in the IEP process? And what might I expect at the end of the IEP meeting? Now that that meeting is done, what are the next steps? So when children are struggling in school, it is important to determine whether a learning, cognitive, or physical disability is affecting your child's educational performance. And if this is the case, your child may be eligible for special education services and related services that can help your child to succeed. Prior to a referral for a special education assessment, it's important that general education interventions and supports are in place for your child. Not all students who are struggling in school have a disability, but they may require a variety of different ways to learn and demonstrate his or her learning. So this can be targeted in general education through interventions and supports. During this school year, all students have had a different educational setting. As we are all very well aware, we have been in a distance learning environment. So it's important for our teams at school sites to discuss the difference between a child having a disability, meaning they require special education, and students experiencing learning loss due to the differences in the learning platform during the school year, because learning loss does not necessarily mean that a child has a disability. So some students do have a disability, and this is determined through a special education process. And IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Act, defines special education as specially designed instruction that is at no cost to the parents, and it needs to be designed to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability. So when an IEP team is discussing special education eligibility, they must follow the laws and the guidelines from the federal government, which is our IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And we must also follow the state government laws, the California Department of Education, Ed Code. So as you probably are well aware, if you have a student in special education, we are full of acronyms in this field. And so anytime you have questions about acronyms or shortening things up, we encourage you to ask us and ask your IEP teams to clarify what does that mean, because there's so many acronyms. One of our acronyms is FAPE, Free and Appropriate Public Education. You will often hear this being discussed in a meeting about your child if they have an IEP, and it falls under the IDEA law, and it's available for students who are between the ages of 3 and 22 years of age. So that we just wanted to make sure we highlight the word FAPE, because you will hear that quite a bit. I'm now going to pass it over to Hillary, who will address how a student becomes eligible for special education.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here today. So when a student is having, as Carrie mentioned, when there are needs identified by the team or potential needs, typically a referral is made for an assessment. So a referral can be made by anyone in the educational team, including the parent, a teacher, or anyone working with that student. Once the referral is made, the team will meet together to discuss the reason behind the referral, the student's strengths, their needs, and review current interventions and the data that the team has regarding the student's academic progress. So once they've met to go over all of these together, the team will set up a plan of action, and whether that is agreeing to the assessment plan, or maybe the team may want to go back to the classroom and try some interventions in the classroom before moving forward with that referral. The team will decide at that time. But if the team is determining that an assessment plan is appropriate, which means that we are going to assess for special education, then they will present one to the parent for consideration. And in that assessment plan, it'll outline all of the areas that the team feels are necessary to look at. So whether that is speech and language, looking at the area of academics, there will always be a psychologist on there to look at how a student learns and what their strengths and areas of need are in learning, and then also a school nurse. So once that assessment plan is signed and agreed upon by the parent, then that gives the assessment team at the school 60 days to complete that assessment, prepare reports for consideration, and then meet with parent and the rest of the team to discuss the findings. So on the next slide, how is a student found eligible for special education, or what do they need? So two things have to happen for a student to be eligible. So first, there has to be a disability. And the second piece of this is that this disability has to have an adverse effect on the student's education and learning, thereby demonstrating a need for special education services. So for example, we may find that a student has a documented disability. Maybe they're, for example, a hearing impairment. However, with the use of hearing aids, the team may find that that disability does not have an adverse effect on the student's education. Perhaps the student is doing very well in class. They're doing very well with their friends. They have an active social life. There's no speech and language concerns. So that student, although they do have a disability, may not qualify for an IEP because there is not an educational impact or an adverse effect on their education. Another example of this is maybe a student has come with a medical diagnosis of ADHD, and there's been some documented concerns about attention. But when we look deeper into the student's day and their progress, we find that it doesn't have an impact on the student's ability to focus in the classroom to the extent that it's negatively impacting their ability to do work or to focus on their teacher. And so the team may say that the student may need a few additional supports to maintain that good momentum, but this may be addressed in the typical general education setting with something we call a 504 plan, which we're not going to get into today, but there are supports available to students who do not qualify for special education. So moving on, once we've established that a disability and an adverse effect, this slide kind of goes deeper into that, looking at those eligibility categories for special education. So for school-age students, kindergarten and above, there are 13 eligibility categories, and they're listed on here. And as Carrie mentioned, we love acronyms in our department. So you can see they're all abbreviated. The takeaway I'd like for us to take away from this slide is not memorizing the acronyms or all the 13 disability categories. But if you ever find that you're in an IEP meeting and you have a student that does qualify for one of these categories, I would like us to remember that we feel free to ask the team, well, what does that mean? How does that disability affect my student in the classroom? What areas might I look for that might be impacting? And I know as a professional that's been in the field for a while, I still ask the psych this at meetings. Okay, so tell me how that's going to impact their learning. What kind of supports do you anticipate they're going to need? And I think those are perfect and valid questions for parents and team members to ask going into this meeting or any meeting to help them feel a little more empowered and to also be part of the conversation. So moving to the next, you've heard us already say the word IEP or the acronym. So what are we talking about when we say IEP? So once a student becomes eligible for special education, you will hear this mentioned a lot, the term IEP, and what it stands for is Individualized Education Plan. And basically what that is it's a very specific plan that the team puts together, taking into account the student's strengths, the student's needs, and from from that input of strengths and needs, we develop targeted goals. And we also develop any accommodations that may be needed in their classroom, as well as any services. And so IEP, really the takeaway from this slide is it should be always individualized. So it should be customized to the student to meet their needs. So two students could be in the same class, they could both have IEPs, but those IEPs will be very different based on those students' individual needs and what they need for them. So going to the next slide, what should you expect before that IEP meeting? So we know the IEP is coming up. Maybe it's that initial IEP, or maybe you have a student already on IEP and we're coming up to that annual meeting. What should we expect? So you should expect a meeting notice to come home. And what that is it notes the proposed time, date, location, or for us now, not necessarily location, but modality, which would be Zoom, of where and how the meeting would be held. And we want to provide the purpose behind the meeting notice is to provide families ample time to make accommodations so that they can attend and be a part of that meeting. Pre-COVID, we used to send it home. You would most commonly see it sent home through the mail or in your student's backpack or both. But during this time, we find that more and more families are utilizing email. It's just how things have changed. And so do expect and look out for that in the email prior to an IEP meeting. And if you know an IEP is coming up and you haven't heard from your team, feel free to reach out and ask. The other piece before the meeting is the teacher or the case manager who manages your child's case may call or email to get your input ahead of time on the student's strengths at home and their interests at home, and also what you perceive as their strengths and their interests at school as well, because it adds to the conversation when we get to the IEP. And it really helps the team take into account what is that student good at, what does that student like, so we can take those interests and customize that IEP to really build on what the student is good at. So on the next slide, this is just more about the meeting notice. So the law requires us to give advanced notice. So that 2 weeks that I mentioned on the last slide is something that comes out of the law so that we provide you ample time. If you don't feel like you've been provided that 2-week notice and you are not able to make the meeting, it is your right to tell the team, hey, I absolutely want to be present and have a time that works for you. The meeting notice, like I said, does need to be sent home prior. And then you might also get a follow-up phone call or a follow-up email from the team, just as an additional reminder, because we all have very busy lives. I know I appreciate the extra reminders. And it should be at a time that's mutually agreed upon. And prior, it would be a time and a place, but right now, most of it's through Zoom. And also, you should be informed of who's going to be at the meeting. So on that meeting notice, it will note everyone that's there. Some parents like to bring additional family members or additional support to the meeting to help them feel a little more comfortable, and we absolutely welcome that. And you can do that as well if you choose so. So now moving on, the next slide, I'm going to pass it over to Kathleen to talk about parents' rights.
Hey, thank you. Hi, everyone. So moving along, once your child has been assessed for special educational services, or once your child is already receiving services, you have many rights as a parent. And these rights are called procedural safeguards or parents' rights. And students between the ages of 3 and 22 receiving special education services are also entitled these rights. And you'll see these rights, they're offered and reviewed with you at every IEP meeting, and they're available in multiple languages. So this notice of procedural safeguards is required under the IDEA, and it must be provided to you whenever you ask for a copy, the first time your child is referred for an assessment, each time you're given an assessment plan to evaluate your child, upon receipt of the first state or due process complaint in a school year, and when the decision is made that constitutes a change in placement. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this slide outlines the many categories of parents' rights, which I'll briefly overview. It's important that if you have any questions regarding your child's educations or your rights and responsibilities as a parent, that you please contact your child's teacher, your case manager, your program specialist, or administrator. They'll be happy to assist you with any of your questions. So in participating in the IEP process, parents must be given opportunities to participate in any decision-making meeting regarding their child's special education program. So parents have the right to participate in IEP meetings about the special education eligibility, assessment, educational placement, and any matters relating to their child's FAPE, or as we said earlier, that acronym stands for Free Appropriate Public Education. And in the case that a parent cannot be identified or located, a district may appoint a surrogate parent to represent a child with a disability. And they too will then have the same procedural safeguards. So with consent and assessment for services, you have the right to request an educational assessment for your child, and no testing will be done without your written permission, and you may revoke that consent at any time. And any services or placement in a special education program must be with your consent. And with regards to resolving any differences, or disagreements, parents have the right to request a hearing should there be a disagreement regarding identification or assessment or placement of your child. And parents have a right to a mediation conference, the right to examine your child's records, and the right to a fair and impartial hearing. Next slide, please.
All right, so I'm going to be going over a little more and diving into the actual IEP meeting. And so as Kathleen just explained, within the procedural safeguards, one of the main components is having parental or guardian participation, because you are a part of the IEP team. So right now we're going to, as I mentioned, dive more so into the IEP meeting and how it is developed and the specific order that it goes into. But first of all, who will I see at my child's IEP? So by law, we are required to have specific members at the IEP meeting, and here they are in red. So parent or guardian, absolutely number one, and then a special education teacher or a service provider if that is your student's case manager and they're only receiving, for instance, speech services. A general education teacher for the students who are participating actively in general education environments. And then also you will have an administrative designee. So someone there making sure that the law is being followed, that we're following district procedures. That might be a principal, another LEA representative, or a program specialist. And then additional members that might be there could be people who are just giving extra input. For example, an evaluator or service provider giving assessment results. It may be someone within the district or out of the district who has additional expertise or knowledge that would be valuable for the IEP team to consider or lean on. And then also always, as much as is appropriate and family feels comfortable with, we always encourage our students to be a part of the IEP process and their IEP meeting. All right, so now we're going to be really looking into the IEP development during the IEP meeting. And so here's one of the graphics that our district has developed that we really try to follow. And so we're going to take a closer look into this, and I'm going to do a somewhat brief overview, and then I'll go into them more extensively as the slides progress. So there are different parts within the IEP and the IEP meeting that legally are required, and there are specific orders that an order to it that is required to be discussed at the IEP meeting. And your role as a parent is critical to be able to provide additional information and your input. So the first of all, the team is going to be discussing the what. So this is going to be our assessment results. It's going to be our present levels, where the student currently is at. We're going to be identifying the strengths, as Hillary had mentioned earlier, of the student, and then also the different areas of need that the IEP team agrees upon to then develop goals for that student. Next, the IEP team is discussing ways to support the student. So this is really the how of the IEP development. So this is going to be including your services, different resources, and during this discussion, the team's going to also consider different accommodations or modifications that the student may need in order to get them the most access to their curriculum, to their instruction throughout the day, and then the most successful in obtaining the goals agreed upon in the what. And then finally is going to be that where. So the team then discusses and determines all the services that will be needed to help the student make progress on their IEP goals. And then the where comes into play. So where will we be providing these services for the student in order for them to make progress? And by law, services should be provided in the least restrictive environments. So the location of the services and where they are going to be provided may change throughout the day and throughout the student's academic career. So every year it might look different depending on what that student needs then and the IEP team agrees upon. All right, so we're first going to be moving kind of into part one of the what. So the first step of the what is really looking into those present levels that I mentioned before. And the present levels is a section of the IEP where we're identifying where the student currently is at, where their present levels are at, where they're at right now. And then also identifying their strengths and then specific areas of need. And so that's also, as Hillary had mentioned earlier, where you really come into play on giving us an idea of what are strengths at home, what are strengths within the community, what are their interests and other hobbies outside of school, because our whole life doesn't revolve around just school and accessing our academics. There's so much more to all of that. And so your input is critical in order to really have the IEP team see the student as a whole child and being able to look at that all of that. And then also just as equally as important is making sure that your concerns are addressed. So what are you seeing at home that they're not able to access their academics, or what are you identifying that they say their struggles are within the school setting? Making sure that you're concerns are addressed and that we're noting them throughout the entire discussion. As we had mentioned, Hillary had also said the teacher or case manager may call you ahead of time of the IEP. And so if you have the opportunity to express those at that point, that's fantastic. If not, I would highly encourage you, just as I always do, write down notes so I don't forget anything whenever I go into an important IEP meeting, to make sure that all your concerns are being addressed. So then kind of the next step of that what is the development of the IEP goals. So as you can imagine, that first step of the present levels plays a huge role in identifying areas of strength, but then also areas of need. And where we look at is, as an IEP team, is looking at those areas of need and then bridging the gap with an IEP goal in order to address and get that student kind of filling that gap and getting them closer to their goal. So your case manager or other members of the IEP team may already come with drafted annual goals. And so again, as I mentioned, the annual goals should be a match to the present levels and the areas of need that have been identified by the entire IEP team. They'll include baselines and then also have measurable goals. So a baseline is, where is that student currently at right now? And then the measurable goal will be, what do we expect? What is a reasonable expectation that we can get the student from their current baseline in an entire IEP year? Where do we expect them to be? And then how are we going to measure this? How are we going to progress monitor this? And how are we going to set them up for success so they are going to be obtaining these goals or as close as possible to them? Any academic goals all need to be connected to Common Core state standards. And then also the IEP team will be identifying with you on when the progress will be reported to you. And so it should be aligning very closely to, if you're in elementary, you get a report every trimester, quarterly if you are in secondary. And so then within all of this goal development, we just highly encourage parents, as we're saying throughout all of this, to continue to ask questions. If you don't understand a goal, please pause the team and ask them to further explain it. Ask them how are we going to measure this progress? How are we going to make sure that we are setting up the student for success and giving them the tools that they need to make these goals? And then always your suggestions. And then also know, as Kathleen was mentioning before, you do have the right to agree or disagree with any of the proposed goals. We highly encourage and want to hear your input because this is an IEP team decision and you are a critical part of that IEP team. All right. So the next part of this is the how. So how kind of moves into determining those services in regards to supports and resources. So what we really are looking at here is the accommodations, the modifications, any specialized services that the students may need and the IEP team agrees upon that will help them make progress on their IEP goals that we developed in the what portion of it. And so again, if you have any questions at this time, I know we're going to just continue to say it over and over again. Always pause the IEP team. Please ask your questions, share your inputs. And this is really where we get to be creative, because in the what we get to talk about, okay, what do we need to focus on? And then the how and the where portion of it is when all of us as an IEP team get to be creative on how are we going to build success for this student. All right, so this is a little bit more of a how, but then we're going to start going into the where. So this is where we're talking about services and placements. So during this portion of the IEP meeting, the team is going to be discussing and determining which services will be needed, as I mentioned before, for the student to make progress on their developed IEP goals. Then it comes into the where the services should occur to support the student's progress. So services should occur in the least restrictive environments, and the location of the services can vary throughout the school day depending on that student's goal and what is being targeted within that goal. So I think what's important to highlight is that, as it says here in the slide, is that legally the IEP team must provide our services and education in the least restrictive environment possible. And then that doesn't always mean that it happens in the same setting. And as we had mentioned with Hillary earlier, and I believe also Carrie, is that this is an individualized IEP. So it's not going to look the same from one student to another. And it may be pulling out for direct services, and might be a teacher coming in and pushing into general education. It may look like a special day class for a portion of the day, but it truly is driven by the present levels, the goals, and what the IEP team thinks is the least restrictive environment. And so this just brings us back to, again, that where that I just hit on pretty well, but overall just a continuum of services that for every student, it may look different on what LRE, the least restrictive environment, may be. And that's one of the reasons why we go through the steps of the what, the how, and the where. And that's why legally also we are asked to go through those specific steps. So we make sure as an IEP team that we're providing the student with the best education, the free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And we are considering all variables in order to make it, make that continuum of services work for that student. And I think what's also really important is every annual IEP, this same process should be going through. So we're making sure that depending on the goals that are developed, we are continuing to give the appropriate accommodations, modifications, as well as we are delivering those services in maybe in different placements.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. As we've stated, you are an equal and important member of the IEP team. You know your child the best, and your input is needed and valued. We also know that it can be intimidating to sit across from a group of people who are talking about your child, especially if it's a large team. But you are your child's best advocate. You know your child the best, and their teachers want you to understand and ask questions. Kind of like we tell our students, there's no stupid questions. So we wanted to just give you an idea of some suggestions of what you can ask when you're at the IEP. And there's a lot of jargon, like we said, there's a lot of acronyms and jargon. So if you're not sure what something means, please ask. We want you to understand the process. And especially at the first few meetings, if you're new to the IEP process, it can be a lot of information to process. So we just want you to feel comfortable asking questions, so you know so you understand what's going on in your child's education. So these should, like the assessment results, should be explained by each member. But again, feel free to ask if you're not sure what that means. As Lindsay already covered this, make sure you understand how the IEP goals will be measured and shared with you. You might also ask about how supports are going to be provided both in and outside the classroom, especially if there's maybe social emotional needs. That's an area of need that's been identified. If there's, they might need support, peer supports, like in the cafeteria or on the playground. Supports don't just have to take place inside the classroom. And you could definitely also ask about curriculum and resources being used to support your child. Those are important. Accommodations, definitely we encourage you to ask questions about the types of accommodations that are being provided. And then also how they are going to participate in the general education and the school activities. Now, your child might receive RSP services, so they're spending most of their time in the gen ed class. But if they are in a special day class, you might ask the team, what are the opportunities for them to participate in gen ed activities. And you can also ask about, you can ask about access to facilities and resources on campus. So for maybe our students who have physical disabilities or motor delays, you want to make sure that they can access the entirety of the campus. And I think this is also a really good question to ask is, how can you support your child at home? Ask your teachers for strategies on, helping with homework, or maybe if, there's some behavior concerns, you can ask for behavioral strategies and techniques to use with your child at home. So those are important questions to ask. And this is a limited, by no means an exhaustive list of questions to ask, but just some general and common ones that we see. Okay, so you've gone through the meeting. You've been given a lot of information. So what you can expect after the end of the meeting, so like we said, the school team will present their offer of FAPE. And remember, that means free and appropriate public education. And once the offer is made, and if you agree to everything presented, the goals, the accommodations, and the services, if you're happy with it all, you sign, and there is a place that you check, yes, I agree to all parts of the IEP. You can sign there. You also have the option to accept only part of the IEP. So for example, maybe you don't agree with a service that's been offered or agree with a goal, you can state that. And there's actually a place there's a consent page where you sign, and there's a place where you can say, where it says, I agree to all parts except, and you can actually handwrite that in what you don't agree with. Or you can decline the entire IEP and special education services. That is your right. And then after that, you do have the right to take the IEP home to review it on your own before you sign. We do recommend that you sign the IEP within a reasonable amount of time. It's important to remember that the school team can't implement the IEP without your permission. So, it's like we said, it's completely within your right that if you want to take it home and review before you sign, but it is important to sign that IEP so the team can move forward with the services that you've agreed to. And I've also had a parent say to me, I'm going to sign now because I know I can always call another meeting if I see something I don't like, and that is 100% okay. That is an option for you as well. And further to that, it's important to remember that a signed IEP is not set in stone, that can never be changed until the next meeting. That's absolutely not true. We talk about, and this is under the procedural safeguards as well, but you have the right to call an IEP meeting anytime. It's not just that annual IEP. We often call the IEP a living, breathing document that can be changed and amended through the year. So if there's something that you're not sure about and you want further clarification, or there's a concern, you can call an IEP. And then at the end of the meeting, you should receive a copy of the IEP. During distance learning, obviously it's a little different. We are offering to email them a copy of the IEP to the family, but if you don't want it emailed or you don't have a printer, you can ask the case manager and the school team. They will arrange to mail you a physical copy of it as well. And then of course, we offer translated to whatever language you need. That's a service we offer as well, and including the reports that come with the IEP. Okay, and then lastly, we wanted to, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. We are actually just at the end here. There are some resources.
I believe I'm on the last slide, Julia, but
Yes, there it is. Okay. Thank you. So these are some resources. There is an LRE checklist that you can go through. It's actually a really nice, it kind of goes through a checklist of the school, of physical integration, looking at the actual IEP, the parent involvement, looking at, the staff, things like that. So it's a nice resource for you if you're curious to, learn more about what an LRE could and should look like. And LRE, is Least Restrictive Environment. There's the procedural safeguards. There's also a glossary of terms, and then these are the website for the California Department of Education, and then the IDEA website as well. And then yes, we'll make sure you will get access to the slides and the resources we've talked about. And I think that's it. I think we're going to open it up to questions. You can, if you want to take yourself off mute, or you can type it in the chat. I noticed there were some questions that were included before. Some of you entered questions previously. A couple of them were asking about, how to involve or get the students engaged with distance learning, which that is not, unfortunately, the scope of this session, but we encourage you to reach out to your child's teacher or the school and their team and find out ways, because we are there to support you and your family and your student. Another one that was asked was, does a school counselor need to be at the IEP? If that's something that the team feels is necessary, if that's a support that the child or the student needs, absolutely, you can request to have that person come. So everything is individualized. And then what was, I think that was, and then do IEPs and BIPs correspond with each other? So a BIP is a behavior intervention plan. And yes, they do. So not every child who has an IEP will have a BIP. But if there is one in their IEP, yes, it's actually built in. There is, it's built into the IEP, so it correlates. And usually there's that plan, there's usually goals, because it is an area of need. If behavior is an area of need that's been identified and the team has developed it, absolutely. And then there's strategies, and there's usually goals related to that as well. So I hope that answered that question.
Julia, I see another question on here. Sorry, I feel like I'm echoey, so I apologize. The question is translated. It says, the teacher sent me an email to sign. She says it is a request to request resources or materials from Medi-Cal, but I have not sent the renewal. Should I sign it or not? I think for Ms. Rivera, what you're referring to, I think I know what you're referring to, but I would be making assumptions. I would advise you to reach out to the teacher and let them know that you want more information on what this form is and what you're signing consent to, and pose that question back to the team so that you understand what you're signing. And then if you don't understand still, then I would reach out to see what it is, because I think I know what you're talking about, but I'm not quite sure if anyone else from the team wants to add in on that.
What I'm thinking it is, and I agree, reach out to the teacher to clarify, but it is a document that we ask parents if your child receives Medicaid. What it is, we're just asking that you sign allowing us, Twin Rivers, to be reimbursed for certain assessments or materials that we do order to support students, but it doesn't impact their actual benefits. So I hope that makes sense. It's just something that we do need your permission. We do get reimbursed for certain things, but it doesn't impact anyone's specific benefits. So, but I would also make sure that's what your teacher is talking about. That's what I think it means.
There was
go ahead.
another question, and it looks like it was answered in the chat, but in case anyone wants to add, It said, what's the difference between a 504 plan and an IEP? So traditionally, I was waiting for you, Julia. So a 504 plan is typically how we address students that have additional needs in the general education setting, and maybe have, as we talked about, some of those students on that slide I did, may have a documented disability, but it's not impacting necessarily to the extent that they need an IEP through special education. So 504 plans are typically done through general education for kids that need additional accommodations, and they have their own set of criteria determining how a student may qualify for one of those. The IEP is the Individualized Education Plan. That's done through special education, and that's where we identify if a student has a disability and it's adversely impacting their educational progress. So that's kind of the very brief explanation of it.
Correct. Okay, and then yeah, someone asked what an IEP does stand for, Individualized Education Plan. Thank you. Let's see, I'm going, oh, okay, great.
And Kathleen, you're doing a great job answering that.
Okay, when I am reading another one, when school opens up and this person's child has autism and tends to run, would I need to call a safety IEP? If that's a concern that you want addressed, yes, you can call an IEP, you can ask for an IEP meeting to talk with the team about how they're going to support your student to make sure that they remain on campus and stay safe. So absolutely, you can do that.